Coming up on Plane Crazy Down Under, Grant's across the ditch in New Zealand, speaking with Jerry and Jan Chisholm at their hangar home on Bridgeparr Aerodrome.
So Boeing said, well, what about if we give you 2 737s? Can you use those in Alaska? And the answer was yes. So I got to upgrade into the 737s.
So I thought, well, actually, it's my money, it's my life. The hell with it, I'll go and have a trial flight. And I fell in love with it.
And we present part 2 of our chat with iconic aviation businessman Steve Paget, OAM.
But I've got to say it was a lot easier in those days. There wasn't the red tape and bureaucracy that goes on today.
It's our first show for 2024 and a big year ahead as we get plane crazy.
We sure are. Thank you, Terry Daniel, and welcome, folks, back to Plane Crazy Down Under, episode 145, it turns out, of the show that talks about aviation here in the Great Southern Land. I'm Steve Fisher, and Grant McHerron. Who thought we would have been saying hello to everybody this many years down the track in 2024?
I know, right? We started in 2009. Yeah, okay, we took a little bit of a break because life got in the way.
Just a little break.
Well, much like for many of us trying to learn how to fly aircraft, life gets in the way, right? But we're back.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, it got in your way a hell of a lot more than mine, I think. But in a really wake-up way. But, mate, yeah, it's 2024. This is our 14th episode of the second series. And as you said, 145th episode all up of the PCDU. Go us.
Yeah, and it's great to be back. I tell you what, this year's, we're looking at some really interesting things in aviation coming up this year. Lots of news around the place, both here and internationally. Particularly, you've been following certain airliner stories lately, but I don't think we really need to touch on that, do we? But
everyone else
anyway.
has.
Yeah, there's some good air shows coming up this year. There's some big announcements coming up in the business side of aviation, which we're really looking forward to exploring as time goes on. And I'm sure we'll have another year of great storytelling. You know, there's so many great stories that we really love telling around the aviation industry in this part of the world. And when we say this part of the world, we also like to include New Zealand. We've had a lot of Kiwi content on the show over the years, and this show, as we start off for this year, is no exception. Grant, you've been travelling.
I certainly have, mate. It was last year. Wound up in New Zealand for family and business kind of reasons, and was able to catch up with Jerry and Jan Chisholm over at their hangar home, an absolutely incredible hangar home, I might point out. I was so jealous, at Bridgeparr, the historic Bridgeparr Aerodrome, just outside of Hastings, which is near Napier in the North Island of New Zealand, on the right-hand side, the east coast. Look it up on Google Maps, you'll find it. It's Napier, New Zealand. Just down southwest from there is Hastings, and just near there is Bridgeparr, spelt P-A. And it was absolutely fantastic to get to meet Jan and Jerry. And they have a 1929 Gypsy Moth that Jan's father actually flew from the UK to Sydney, shipped over to Auckland, and then flew down to Bridgeparr. So we start off by talking with Jerry about his experiences. He was a bush pilot in Alaska and actually was bush pilot flying 737s at one point, but he's got time flying civilian Hercules and also the MD-11. So he's got some good stories to tell. And then talk to Jan about her father's flight, bringing that Gypsy Moth down. It's just amazing.
You know, Grant, interesting talking about bush flying in Alaska and all that part of the world. I do note with interest one of my favourite shows, Ice Pilots, from the day. I noticed that Buffalo Airways, I know it's in Canada, but I think they're doing a bit of bush flying with a 737 that they've upgraded to recently. You know, that'll be a good story to follow as well. But it always seems that that part of the world encourages that kind of flying adventure.
Yeah, well, as you'll hear, Jerry has some interesting tales about getting in and out of very short strips in a gravel-kitted 737, but back in the 200 series days. So way before the current problems, back when the 737 was really cool. Oh, I probably can't say that, but too late. Anyhow, moving right along.
Well, I know it gets pretty cool with the door open, I hear.
Oh, so moving on. Oh, sorry, was that the lawyers already sharpening their pencils? So, dude, just to let you know, there's actually more content that I recorded with Jan and Jerry. I've split it up into parts because I also work with our friend Dave Homewood over in New Zealand, and we produce Warbird Radio Down Under for the Warbird Radio Network. And Dave and I used to work together on Warbird Radio Live, which we actually recorded live and it was streamed live over in the US on the Warbird Radio Network. These days, Warbird Radio is doing pre-recorded stuff, and so it's back. It's happening. Warbirdradio.com. You'll hear a couple that we've already done individually or together, and this one will probably be coming out, I'd say, in a month. I'm not sure what the release cycle is going to be, but if you want to hear more, we've got Jan talking about one of the other aircraft in their hangar, and we've got Jerry talking about flying the P-51 Mustang, the B-25 Mitchell, which he flew as a warbird, doing firebombing, and also his Booker Jungmann German biplane. So classic stuff. Head on over to warbirdradio.com. You want to be subscribed to that anyhow, but the Warbird Radio Down Under segment, you'll hear more about Jan and Jerry there.
Fantastic. Well, a couple of great interviews there, which we'll get into in just a sec. And also in this episode, we'll be doing part 2 of our 3-part series talking to Australian aviation business legend, really, Steve Paget, OEM. So, Grant, it's 2024. There's lots to talk about in aviation. Looking forward to getting into it. And you know what? Let's do that right now.
Jerry Chisholm, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Quite well, thanks.
Fantastic. Well, Jerry, we're standing here in your hangar, which is also your home, and the rain is falling. So no flying, but a great time to have a chat. Mate, you started off in Alaska. What got you into flying up there?
My father was always a private pilot, even before World War II. But when he joined up the military, or went to join the military, they found out he was colorblind, so that put him out to be a pilot. But he was, a rated private pilot before then. Then when I came along, and after the war, he bought a surplus military airplane, PT-26, which the Canadians called the Cornell. And, had it all painted up civilian colors. And as I understand it, when I was quite young, I used to fly around on his lap. The first thing I remember in my whole life was when he took me up in an air coupe and he did a loop. Wow. And I was amazed. This was when I was 4 years old. I was amazed I could look up and see the ground and look down to see the sky. And so he always had private airplanes that worked in with his business as a power line construction company. And as his company got more successful, he got into better airplanes. And he and his, and my uncles, his brother and brother-in-law, always were very keen sportsmen, hunters, and fishermen. So he always had the appropriate airplanes in Alaska to service that need. Like I say, as time went on, he kept upgrading airplanes and getting into fast twins. And then at some point in his career, we took one of our airplanes down south after I had my commercial license. We took it to Oklahoma, Cessna 180, to get an engine overhaul. And on the way back, we came through Northern California and we saw an ad for cheap helicopter training in an old Bell 47D1. And so we stayed there about a week and we each got about 7 hours of duel. I guess I should mention we were pretty competitive when we were flying the 180. It'd be, I'd do a leg and we'd rate each other's landings, and he'd do a leg and we'd give a rating to the landings. So we got about 7 hours in this Bell D1, and one night the instructor was talking to both of us, and to me he said, "You're doing real well. If it goes that well tomorrow, you probably solo." Later that night, my dad decided we had to get back to Alaska. Because apparently he didn't think that it was appropriate for me to solo before he soloed. But he got the helicopter bug, and got into helicopters as they applied to building power lines. There was new part of the industry to use helicopters to set power poles and set big towers. And so he bought a Hughes helicopter that advertised, "We'll teach you to fly the helicopter if you buy it." Mm-hmm. So that started him out in his helicopter career that he stayed in for the last half of his career and got more than 15,000 hours of helicopter time. Meanwhile, my commercial career was also extending and getting into bigger airplanes and big cargo airplanes in Alaska. The pipeline came along in the 70s, and I got upgraded into Hercules, commercial Hercules. So I flew those for 15 years and got over 10,000 hours in the Hercs with a company that did incredibly well. At one time, our company based out of Fairbanks had 15 Hercules. Each Herc was doing about 5 trips a day to the North Slope for, at that time, $5,000 a trip. And the money was coming in by the bucketsfuls. And the CEO of the company decided, in order to use up some of that money, that he would buy a 767, the launch customer for a 767 that hadn't been flown yet, because he thought that by the time they came out, that they'd be a super popular airplane and it would be a good investment. So a few years later, the 76 came out, and Boeing said, "What are we going to do with your airplane?" And he says, "We can't use it in Alaska." And in fact, they weren't that popular an airplane. So Boeing said, "Well, what about if we give you 2 737s? Can you use those in Alaska?" And the answer was yes. So I got to upgrade into the 737s. Wow. Then early on in the game, we weren't paid very well early in the Herc program. And the boss said, if we make it through this tough times, and if we are successful, he says, "I'll take care of you guys. So I'll make sure that you're well remunerated." So at a certain point, after 2 or 3 years in the 737, special gravel kit airplanes, I went to the boss and said, "You said that you'd take care of us, and everybody's being poorly paid. Especially co-pilots are not even on a living wage. And so we're going to form a union." And so we did, and it took a couple of years before it came time for the big strike in order to get the co-pilot pay up to a livable wage. And of course, the big tourist season in Alaska starts June 1st. So that's the day of the strike. Oh, wow. And I was president of the union and chief negotiator. And at the 11th hour before the start of the strike, he took the other negotiating team and he says, "I'll talk to you, but I won't talk to Jerry Chisholm." And they settled the strike in the favor of the union. But he said, "There's only one thing. Mm-hmm. Jerry Chisholm has to go." So I got fired. And he told me at that time, he says, "I'll make sure you never get a job in America again in the airlines." So I went overseas. So that took me to Indonesia to fly for an airline that got some new 737s.
Which airline was that?
It was Airfast Indonesia.
Okay.
And they served the largest copper mine in the world out in Irian Jaya, which is the Indonesian half of New Guinea. That at that copper mine, they employed 30,000 people. And we had at least one airplane jet a day go in there and move their people back and forth. But we didn't have our own heavy maintenance facility. So we brought the airplanes to Christchurch.
That's a long way to come for maintenance.
It is. For Air New Zealand to do the heavy maintenance checks, which was about every 1,500 hours on the airplanes. And that would put an airplane in Christchurch for at least a week. And I'd rent a car and I'd go out and meet people. And that's where I met my wife, Jan.
Wow.
I had some other friends that had a business in Wanaka, and he had a tiger and a chipmunk. And he says, we're going down to this Tiger Moth Club meeting in Mandeville, down near the bottom of the South Island near Gore. So I took the chipmunk down. He took the tiger, which I had been using, and he introduced me to Jan. She had brought a tiger all the way from Hawke's Bay on the North Island to compete. And I was hugely impressed that she, I think, won the non-instrument circuit and the spot landing competition, and maybe a few other of the competitions. So I was quite impressed. Let's see, at a certain point, I finished up with the job in Indonesia, and later I came to have a job with EVA Air, flying MD-11s out of Taipei worldwide, including flights into Auckland. And so the time off schedule was quite good, and free travel on the airline anywhere we wanted. So I continually visited Jan, and we went skiing together and such, and flying Tiger Moth Club fly-ins. I always found it easy to find a tiger moth to fly to these various fly-ins. Let's see what happened then. Oh, then I, at a certain point, I retired from EVA Air and the MD-11 and moved out of Anchorage, was my home of record, and moved to New Zealand. And that's why we have this hangar house on Hastings Airport, where we keep our gypsy moth.
It's a beautiful aircraft.
And so we're right here by it, and we have the history of it on the wall here. It's a family airplane in the respect that Jan's dad flew it from England to Sydney in 1934. Then it was shipped across the Tasman, and her dad flew it here until 1939 or 40, when the government grabbed all of the civil airplanes. They thought they might need it for training. It didn't get much use for training during the war because there were all the new Tiger Moths available, which is a more suitable airplane for training pilots. Then after the war, it was put back on the market and owned by a series of different airlines and flying organizations until it became pretty poor shape in about the 1960s, I think. And then the hulk of it was taken up by a man named Lee Middleton, that was a woodworking class teacher in school. And in his spare time, in the next 30 years, he replaced all of the wood in the airplane.
All of the wood?
All of the wood.
Wow.
And rebuilt it to like new condition. When we first talked to him about it, we said, of course, if you ever sell this airplane, because of the history, and Jan's dad is the one that brought it here, we'd like first choice at it. He said, well, I'm going to have this airplane until I die. And he was about 60 then, and we figured he'd live to be 100. But in fact, within about 10 years after that, he got arthritis. And it takes a little bit of agility to get in and out. And so he sold it to us. And so it's here in our hangar. When we have other airplanes that need to be in the hangar, we fold the wings, and it sits right along one side of the hangar. And at times in this hangar, we've had 6 airplanes.
Oh, wow.
But as it is right now, we only have 2 airplanes in here. And so we have the wings extended. It's similar to an English sports car in that it requires tinkering with all the time. It always has something to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
We like messing about with airplanes.
Yeah. I noticed the collection of tools, gear, dope, fabric, everything.
Mm-hmm. There's always something to do.
So, coming back to your aviation career, how long have you been in New Zealand?
Well, it started coming when I first met Jan. It was about 25 years ago.
Yeah.
But then after I retired from the EVA Air, it's been about 15 years.
Okay. Now, you were flying smaller aircraft at first, then you're on to, as you said, the Hercules, and then the MD-11 and the 737, of course. How did you find flying the Hercules, the 73 and the MD-11? Were there any particular quirks about any of them that stand out?
The Herc is just like a big Super Cub, big fat wing, instant lift. The big powerful propellers blow over about 60% of the wingspan onto big flaps. And it's an airplane. It's real easy to fly, hydraulically boosted controls. And it's one of my favorites in that it always will do more than you need for it to do, even in tight situations. It'll perform beyond your expectations and get you out of trouble. So it's one of my favorites in that respect. The opposite of that is the MD-11. The DC-10, precursor of the MD-11, was very popular here in New Zealand, and all the pilots that I've ever talked to that flew the DC-10 thought it was a great airplane. But in the commercial big airplane market, it because it had 3 engines, people thought that it should do at least 75% of what a 747 would do. But it didn't quite do it. So after Douglas was bought by McDonnell and turned into McDonnell Douglas, the fighter people from McDonnell Douglas decided they were going to make a Super DC-10. So they stretched the airplane. They've got more wingspan, bigger engines, and it just wasn't designed for the work that they were trying to get out of it. I was hugely disappointed and shocked, in fact, that each airplane that EVA had, and they had about a dozen of them, each airplane had its own decrement schedule of how far it wouldn't do what the book said it would do.
Oh, wow.
When you were doing flight plans. You could go through a flight plan. You knew how much fuel it took for takeoff and climb and cruise, and you go through these plans. And one of the worst ones had to apply a 5.5% decrement to those figures.
Jeez.
But that's how they sold airplanes. One of the best ones only had a 2.5% decrement. So it just wasn't very commercially viable. And little by little, and it didn't have the range either. Little by little, EVA converted all their passenger models into freighters. Yeah. And they figured freight wouldn't complain if they had to stop in Anchorage for fuel.
Yeah. Well, they were, a lot of them still flying with FedEx.
Oh, yeah. Hugely popular as a freight airplane.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have the range, but the freight doesn't complain.
Yeah. And you've probably got freight for Anchorage anyhow. So you might as well
a little bit of that. Yeah. And it's generally each big airplane has an appropriate simulator for training. And in every case of a Boeing simulator, they say, even though it seems to fly quite nicely, they say, don't worry, when you get in the real airplane, it flies even better. Well, in the MD-11 simulator, the real airplane flew just as badly as the simulator.
Oh, no.
It's like the controls aren't hooked up to real solid cables. It's like they're hooked up to bungees or something.
Oh, wow.
It's just a real pig to fly.
How'd you find that compared to, like, which models of the 737 were you flying?
Well, the 200, 300, and 400. Yep. But the 200 was my favorite. We had a lot of, we had the shortest airfield that we operated into in the world, at 3,900 feet long. Wow. Gravel and snow at Dutch Harbor. And that was like bush flying a jet. It was a lot of fun.
Wow. Any particular memorable stories that you got from?
Well, not really. It's but
The statute of limitations has passed.
yeah, that's right. No, it was just interesting. Sometimes the weather at Dutch Harbor would be bad for a week, and they wouldn't have any airplanes there, and the station manager would be a little bit loose with the truth on what the runway condition was.
Yeah,
he'd tell us that even though it's snow and ice and slush, he said, I've been out there with my pickup and the conditions are good. Well, it turned out to be not quite so good, but the 200 had the really good reverse buckets.
Mm-hmm.
Those reverse buckets were so good that you could back it up and taxi.
Wow.
You could even taxi uphill backwards.
Oh, wow.
Because the reverse was so efficient.
Yeah.
So we needed that on occasion when it was very slick ice runways.
So now that you've come to New Zealand, you've flown more aircraft than the Gypsy and Tigers and the Chipmunk that you've already mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I understand you've done some flying down around Hood Aerodrome at Marsden.
Oh, a little bit, yeah. Yeah, I got to fly the Fokker triplanes and the Fokker D7. My favorite of all was the SE5.
Oh, yeah.
The early airplanes, especially the rotary powered airplanes, rotary engine like the Camel and such, had also a nasty gyroscope in the front that foiled a lot of people.
That mass spinning around the crankshaft.
It made them very tricky, and apparently it's said that killed more people in training than they did in combat. But by the time the SE5 came along with the various V8 engines, it flies like a modern biplane, if you can call a biplane modern. A modern biplane is like, for instance, the 1930s airplanes, like a Waco, for instance.
Yeah.
And the SE5 flies very similar. It's just a real sweet airplane.
Nice, solid, but also nimble. And
oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so do you still go down to Hood and fly down there occasion?
No, that's all in the past. On occasion, I have done some flying since then with some of the World War I replicas at Omaka Aerodrome.
Yeah.
And I do test flying of those type of things.
Cool.
That's a lot of fun.
Okay. Well, speaking of World War II aircraft, old aircraft, biplanes, etc., we started talking just before about the beautiful Gypsy Moth. So the Gypsy Moth was the precursor to the Tiger Moth.
Yes, exactly. It pretty much started out light aviation in England. And when it came time for the military to use it as a trainer, which they did, they decided that the fuel tank right above the front cockpit was a hindrance to get in, to allow the instructor to get in and out of, or in the event of a dire emergency, in order to bail out of.
Mm.
And so de Havilland moved the fuel tank and the front wing, top wing attach point forward of the front cockpit. And in order to maintain the center of gravity where it should be, then they swept back the wings in order to take care of that problem, and made the Tiger Moth. I think the first Tiger flew in about 1931.
And you were saying the other day, you were saying it's got the same wing as the Gypsy. They just canted it and put an extension in there.
Yeah, they used all the same parts of the Gypsy for the Tiger that they could, including the wing attach points. In order to sweep back the wings, I think they cut the rear spars 4.5 inches so that the wings swept back to maintain the center of gravity.
Which, of course, means the ribs are no longer parallel with the airstream.
We thought that when this flew, that it would be faster than Tigers. But by the time they had, another thing they wanted for the Tiger was better visibility out the front. So they inverted the engine, sloped the nose down away from the pilots for better visibility. And they increased the bore of the engine another 4 millimeter to get an extra 10 horsepower for the Tiger. And so, in fact, with the same pitch prop on both airplanes, the Gypsy or the Tiger, at the same RPM, they fly at the same speed.
Wow. Okay, so that makes it quite good for them to be in formation or traveling alongside each other.
Yep.
And how does she fly?
It flies a little better than a Tiger Moth. It's got a little more lift. It lands and takes off almost 5 miles per hour slower. And so lands a little bit shorter, even though it has no brakes. Now the tail skid bites into the grass a little bit and gets in. We've got a little area out in front of our hangar here that we use for takeoff and landing that's about 200 meters, and it gets in and out of that quite nicely.
Wow.
Without problems. Yeah, we love it. And the fact that the wings fold for storage means that when we travel across country, very seldom are left out in the rain. Because even when anybody has a hangar, we show them that we can fold the wings and slide along one hangar wall, and we almost always get inside for the hangar where the Tigers are all parked outside.
Another good reason for a Gypsy.
Yeah.
Well, Jerry, thank you very much for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Jan White, welcome to the show.
Hi, Grant.
Great to have this opportunity. Thank you so much for allowing me to come to the house that you and Jerry have here on Bridgepaar Aerodrome and the wonderful hangar that we're standing in as the rain falls on the roof.
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a dream, really. And people so often say, do you still live at Bridgepaar? And we both say, well, they'll take us out of here in our boxes.
Well, surrounded by aviation, which is wonderful in anybody's terms. So what got you into flying?
Well, it was when I was working in Australia, really. I was aware of flying because I knew Dad had been a pilot, but I thought you had to be clever. And I was madly into horses. That was my life. And when I was in Australia, I became aware my boss had his own airplane that didn't live on the property, but he would call up his private pilot and fly up to the Northern Territory and things like that. And just the association there made me think, oh, maybe I could do that, because his was a private pilot. And so that's what gave me the idea. And I couldn't wait to get home after 2.5 years and tell Dad that finally we had something in common, because he didn't go with horses much. And he poured cold water all over it. So I was so disappointed. I rang my boss in Australia. Well, he didn't make trunk calls in those days unless there was a death in the family. And I must have mentioned something to him. And in the end, he said, oh, how's your flying going? Coming along? Oh, and I said what Dad had said. How he said, oh, well, my opinion of you is gone. So I thought, oh. And this guy was a double gold medalist in 3-day eventing for Australia. And one thing and another, he had probably Australia's greatest horseman, I should think, so ever. So I thought, well, actually, the hell with it. It's my money. It's my life. I've been making my own decisions for a few years now. The hell with it. I'll go and have a trial flight. Dad doesn't need to know. And I fell in love with it. So went from there, really. And in the end, Dad was quite proud, and I said to my favourite aunt years later, Auntie Zena,
oh, yeah,
why was Dad so anti me learning to fly? And she just looked at me and said, he was worried about you. Never occurred to me.
Yeah.
Because in the war years, instructing, he'd seen some horrible things even instructing. So, but not being one to show any kind of emotion, I mean, it never,
yeah.
Well,
He was trying to protect you.
Yeah, but I didn't realize. I just thought he was being negative.
So where did you learn to fly?
Here, Bridgepar.
Oh, really? And what were you flying?
Well, the Cub was $18 an hour. I didn't know anything about airplanes, and I said to the second instructor, can I learn in the Cub? Well, he poured cold water over that because it was harder for the instructor, and I had the money saved. So I went with the Cherokee, which was a little bit more expensive. When I got my PPL, I instantly went to the Cub. I wished I'd done all my training in it. And, so
you transitioned to the Cub and the tail wheel addiction was born.
Yep. And then I sold everything I had. And I've been working full time while I was doing my training, and it worked in really well. And it wasn't far away. And then I went to England and, sort of did a bit of flying over there, which was so expensive. But every time I did some overtime, I'd think, oh, that's an extra 10 minutes flying. So instead of doing lots of things that traveling people do, it was, I can do a little bit more flying over there.
It is something that I've noticed is once you start flying, everything becomes, well, if I spend the money on that, that's 2 hours of flying. I'd rather go flying.
Yeah, that's right.
So how long were you in the UK for, and where were you flying there?
Well, I started off flying at Biggin Hill, and for a brand new PPL, I can't believe how brave I was, really. But while doing that, I came across an airfield in Kent, Head Corner, a grass airfield, quite quiet. And that suited me much better. So I managed to get myself a job there the next season, working on the farm. Got involved with flying robins and things like that there.
So you were flying over in the UK for a year or two or multiple years?
Well, I ended up there quite legally, I might say. I ended up there for 7 years. I sort of did get involved with somebody who part-owned his own robin, so flew that quite a bit. Really nice aircraft. And then when I came home, I got involved with tiger moths. Boyfriend in New Zealand owned his own and was rather irreverent, I guess you might say, the most lovely guy, but he was no instructor. He just owned his own airplane and let me fly it. You know, we'd fly together and he would fly one leg, I'd fly another, and then he just used to let me fly it off his farm strip. Like, he must have been crazy. But I just can't believe the opportunity I got.
You were flying tiger moths in the North Island, but also going to the South Island for competitions?
Well, he ended up having to sell his tiger. Then I sort of had to scrounge renting one or two others as they came available. And they'll never let me pay for anything. But you know, every now and again I'd be able to buy a 44-gallon drum of white spirits, which is what we ran them on in those days.
Wow.
But yeah, there was a helicopter guy here who had his father had restored a tiger, but he was not interested. So I was able to rent that, and that's what I took down south.
And that was where you met Jerry, and things progressed from there. And
well, after a long time,
yeah, quite some time of him being based overseas, coming back, and so on. But eventually, you're here in the hangar home, the dream of many of us who fly. Yeah, and you've got quite a bit of space here, and of course, the pride of place in the hangar is your father's gypsy moth.
Yeah, that's right. It's sort of pretty surreal, really.
I know, because I mean, we'll come to the details of his flight down from the UK to here, and then it was impressed, and then it was restored, and then you folks managed to get it, as Jerry was telling us earlier. So you've got your father's gypsy moth, a 1930s aircraft, here in the hangar.
1929.
Well, there you go. That's right. He flew down here in the 30s. So,
yeah.
And you've got a huge collection of memorabilia from his flight and his adventures and his early days here at Bridgepar that I've been fortunate to have a look at. Absolutely amazing, the maps and everything. Was it because your father was a collector? Did you realize the heritage value of all that memorabilia later on?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and it's a huge concern to me as to what to do with it when when we're not around, because it's Dad, like me, hated throwing anything out. I don't know where he put it all, because there wasn't much room in the luggage locker. But you know, the receipts from hotel in, I don't know, Rajasthan or Bangkok or somewhere like that. Got all those and fuel receipts and
the invitation for the Wentworth, I believe.
Yes,
in
that's
Sydney,
right.
For the Iva. That's amazing. And a letter from Nancy Byrne.
yeah, yeah.
It's incredible. Let's talk about his flight. What inspired him to fly to Australia from the UK?
I think as a boy, I've got one of his old scrapbooks and there's ships and things like that and odd, funny old airplanes. Well, they weren't old then. He obviously had an interest in aviation because he subscribed to the Airplane Monthly, I think, from England. And, of course, it took months to ever get here. And, of course, like all people, he read a lot. And I think he read a lot of Kipling. And he got his private license at Bridge Par, probably the other field, then decided he'd like to get in the RAF. And he'd got a legacy from, family legacy. And so he and a friend went to England to try and get in the RAF. Mum said the Kiwis were not treated very well, or the colonials weren't. Anyway, they did manage to get in. And Dad felt the cold a lot. And I think through his reading of Kipling, I think he got this idea of flying in somewhere warm like India or Africa, because, the sun never set over the British Empire. And, of course, here were these horrible, horrible conditions over there and pea soup fogs and way worse than it is now, I think, because you don't get pea soup fogs really.
No.
And just cold and miserable and a few other things. And he never wrote much or said much, but after he died, I found in his diary an entry saying, "Think I'll fail final exams, can do better." And another page, "Think we'll buy a moth and fly home, basically."
Wow.
And he must have said something to his mother because I found a letter from her to another brother saying, "Stan says he wants to fly back. I don't know whether he means commercially or himself." So no big drama. And in those days, there was so much support and encouragement from the authorities to do this sort of thing. Nobody said you couldn't.
Well, there was the MacArthur Robertson.
Exactly.
Yeah, the big race going on. There was a number of people. Hinkler had flown solo. And
Oh, yeah, he was not the first by any stretch.
but they'd established that it was
Doable.
not a weird thing to do.
Yeah. And of course, Britain was doing anything to encourage its empire to expand and all the rest of it, as I say, rightly or wrongly. So he obviously did a lot of research and bought a used moth from Brian Lewis of London. It had been all around Europe, had been to North Africa, Casablanca, it had been to Rangoon already.
Wow. So it was a very well-travelled moth.
Yeah, I said to him, "Gosh, Dad, your airplane knew its way around the world." He said, "Yeah, that's one of the reasons I bought her." Some wealthy lady had owned her and had a swashbuckling pilot to fly her around. And I said to Dad once, I never talked about these sorts of things, but I said, "Do you think Rupert Belville was Mrs. Bailey's boyfriend? Or was it Mrs. Montague? I can't quite remember." And Dad said, "Well, it would have been a waste if he wasn't." That was the nearest we ever got to talking about anything like that.
Oh, that's gold.
So he had a long-range tank put in the front, an extra 40 gallons in the front cockpit, an extra gallon of oil, did some test flying. Of course, it was all fed in. And the boarding house he was living in down Brompton Road, I think, in London, he never told anyone except his good friend. And so he went out to the airport. John took him out to Heston, and Dad never went back with him. And their mates sort of said to John, "Well, where's Stan?" John said, "Oh, he's just started off to fly to Sydney." Of course, they didn't believe him.
Yeah, funny. I mean, funny that. It's like, oh, no, he's just going around the block or something. He'll be back soon, yeah.
Yeah. And Dad said that he thought that, he might get as far as India or something. He wasn't that experienced. He put it in a box, get it back home in a box. He was quite, realistic about his chances, but he actually doubled his solo flight time by the time he got to Sydney.
Wow, because it would have been multiple hops. You've got them on the side of the aircraft. He Went through, what was it? Looks like about 30?
Oh, over 40.
Over
yeah.
40. Okay. There's a lot of names painted on the side of that aircraft.
Well, this aircraft was used for the TV1 film called Gene, obviously about Gene Batten.
Mm-hmm.
And the producers were sensible enough to realise the difference between a tiger and a gypsy. So they called me up and asked if it would be possible to use this aircraft, which we agreed to, because we know how silly it would have been to have had a tiger moth with Gene Batten.
Yeah.
But then we had engine problems, and it was all absolutely to the last minute that we actually, with help from our great friend John Pheasant, that we actually managed to get the airplane there in time to do the flying for it. Yeah.
So how long did it take your father to get down here? How many days, months, etc.?
It was about 6 weeks. He said he was not in a hurry. His first major stop was in Paris. They took his logbooks away because the weather was foul. He said he wouldn't have been stupid enough to fly anyway. That was the only place where they wouldn't speak English. So he was held up for 4 days there, and then just after Singapore, he got malaria. So he was held up for 10 days recovering from malaria.
Did that come and cause problems for him later in his life?
I don't know. I don't think so, but he used to take quinine tablets. And eventually his doctor wouldn't give him any, so he would go to the vet to get
Where there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah, that's right. Just to stave any possibility of it off.
Okay. So after he recovered in Singapore?
Well, then it was flying down through Indonesia, and, the big Achilles heel of all those early flyers was the Timor Sea, from Surabaya to Darwin, of course. And that was interesting because that was about an 8-hour flight, or 8.5-hour flight over water, no islands until nearly Australia. And he was 2.5 hours into the flight. His navigation was 2 compasses, and he realised that the 2 compasses had been reading differently.
Which one's right?
Yeah, so I asked Jerry, how on earth could he have worked out which one was correct? Because it was not the one that he took a punt, and the one that he hadn't been flying on he reckoned was correct. And Jerry said, well, he probably knew where the sun should be at a certain time of the day. So he did, I guess it's the 1 in 60, I don't know, but he said they were not trained in the Air Force to do this, 20 minutes at right angles, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, until he reckoned that he had worked out how long he'd been on that other track for. I don't know how. My mind would just go to a mush.
Yeah.
And eventually managed Darwin.
Wow. And I believe in Darwin, he got some sagely advice from the old timers there.
Yeah, in the bar that night, a couple of old bush pilots said, well, Sonny, don't go chasing compass courses. And he thought, well, they were still alive and they must have known what they were talking about. A couple of English guys obviously thought, what the hell would they know? Never seen again. So I guess it was the ore and the soil that messed with the compass. And he said that was by far the hardest navigation.
That blows my mind because you've just done this big crossing of nothing but water, and now you're over land. But I believe the difficulty related to the maps.
Well, yeah, the map would show a road, but you couldn't see it because it was blown over by sand and dirt, and it would show rivers or streams, but they were all dried up. And they were sort of indentations, but all over the place, and might show a town. But if you're lucky, it was a wool shed with a name on it, or, just a small group of buildings in the middle of absolutely nowhere. And not being able to follow a compass course, it just blows my mind because I've flown over just about the whole width of Australia in let's say a 777 with clear daylight, no clouds, and looked down, and a lot of that was over territory further north where he would have been, and just beggars belief how those people, the genes of this world and others, how they navigate, how they worked it out.
Because there was nothing. There was just big empty.
Thousands of miles of nothing.
Yeah.
Oh, one time he did 2 out landings in his logbook. One, he asked where he was, and the other one, Duchess was actually where he wanted to be anyway.
A happy coincidence.
Yeah.
So eventually he made it to Sydney, and you've got photos of the aircraft being towed through Sydney to make it to the docks to be shipped to New Zealand. Mm-hmm. How long did he stay in Sydney?
Oh, just a few days, I think. Yeah, and just enough time to get the airplane ready for shipping. And in the logbook too, it says that there were puffs of smoke coming from number 2 cylinder as he was coming into Sydney to Mascot.
Hopefully they were able to check it out for him.
Yeah. One cylinder had been changed in India. He'd taken a spare cylinder and cylinder head.
So he shipped it across to New Zealand. Did he land in Auckland and then flew it down to here? Mm-hmm. Then it was here until the war.
Yep.
Well, Jan White, thank you so much for the time to chat and for coming on the show.
Thanks, Grant. It's been scary.
You've done great.
You might think that in the Australian Defence Force you'll only ever have the one job, but take a closer look at how it invests in your career and you'll find training for new roles as well as gain professional, tertiary and trade qualifications.
Learn more at adfcareers.gov.au.
Keeping up to date with the latest news is a huge part of our daily lives. Now you can have news on demand with the Australian Independent Radio News app. News and sport in your pocket whenever you want it. Wherever you are in the world, if you call Australia home, you can stay in touch with the Air News app. Download it now for news on the go.
This is Air News.
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 Australian Independent Radio News.
Imagine if you were very sick, feeling so bad you could hardly get out of bed. But you had to get up and drive 600 kilometres to hospital for treatment. You'd be eternally grateful for Angel Flight, whose pilots fly them there free of charge. So please, support the work of Angel Flight or get involved as a volunteer pilot or driver. Log on to angelflight.org.au and help bring relief to people who so desperately need some.
And welcome back. You're listening to episode 145 of Plane Crazy Down Under. It's our first show for 2024 and it's great to have you with us. Well, in the previous episode, we presented the first of a 3-part series which we recorded in 2019 with Steve Paget, OAM, one of Australia's true modern-day aviation pioneers, following his journey into the business and the many twists and turns along the way. This series was recorded for the Airwaves podcast, which we produced for Aviation Trader at the time, and we thank them for allowing us to use this content again here on PCDU. At the end of the last instalment, we'd reached the stage where Steve had set up his well-known charter and sales company, Aeromil Pacific. Let's pick up the story from here.
You've moved Aeromil up to Queensland, and there must have been something in the air, and you know, Queensland is the home of the big pineapple and the big this and the big everything, and you know, Aeromil really went leaps and bounds, didn't it, once you moved up there?
Yeah, well, what happened was, apart from it was a fresh environment and really invigorated both me and my staff, and most of the staff that came up were new, so that was great too, even though some did come with me. But Don Kendall would start at the next phase, which was, he came to me one day and he said, "Look, Steve," he said, "I've been talking about you to Ansett, and Ansett are struggling with their 737 operation in the Maroochydore. What they prefer to do is run into Brisbane and have a feeder from Brisbane to Maroochydore." So I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more." And he said, "Well, look, no, I won't tell you more." He said, "You go tell your story to Ansett. I'll tee up the appointment with the people who matter, and they want to talk to you. You go talk to them." So I flew to Melbourne and I went and talked to them. And again, cut a long story short, they said to me, "Look, you know, what we'd like you to do, you've got Bandar Andes. It's a great aeroplane. Why don't you run a Bandar Andes service from Brisbane to Maroochydore?" And I said, "Well, geez, that means I've got to start an airline." I they said, yep, and you have to do it very quickly. So again, I had a young fellow. And I'll diversify, if I may, the story a little bit. When I moved up here, I got a call from Bond University, and Bond University said to me, "Look, we've got a young fellow here, very young fellow, who loves aviation. He's very smart. He's got a computer degree. but he just wants to be in aviation. Ansett had knocked him back. Qantas had knocked him back. Everybody in aviation had knocked him back. I've heard you may be able to help him. And I said, look, I don't have a job for a pilot who wants to be a pilot. I don't have a job for a pilot now. I can't help you. And they said, yeah, but can you advise him at least? He'd love. I said, well, if he's prepared to drive to Maroochydore on a Saturday morning, I'll come to the airport and see him. It's 3 hours for him and it's 5 minutes for me. So this young fella flew up here, very impressed with him. This relates to Sunshine. And I was very, very impressed with him. And at that time, just at that time, for interesting reasons, I bought a business called the Red Baron at Noosa Airport. Now, the Red Baron was an old twin-engine aeroplane with a big rotary engine, and a biplane with a rotary engine. It was actually an AGCAT, a Grumman AGCAT, with 2 seats in it for tourism. And I didn't have a pilot for it, so I said to this fellow, I tell you what, if you go get yourself a Piper Cub endorsement, and if you can fly that, and the instructor tells me you can, I'll get you a AGCAT endorsement, and if the instructor tells me you can fly that, I'll give you this job flying tourists out of Noosa. But you've got to pay for the Cub endorsement yourself, and if that doesn't work, bad luck. That's cut a long story short. This guy's been with me for 21 years. That's Phil Laffer, who's now probably the most senior check and training corporate pilot in the country, now running my simulator business. So from that day, he had 300 hours. He's now got 10,000 hours, and just a wonderful guy. And he's he's sort of the next generation, if you like. I hope will follow me into this out of this business. But anyway, so what happened then? Because Phil was with me, and I said to Phil, "Now you run an airline." He said, well, how am I going to do that? I said, "I'll set it all up. You get all the training going. You do it all." So Phil ended up being chief pilot and general manager of Sunshine Express Airline, which we ended up flying 10 services a day to Brisbane and return from Maroochydore, ultimately buying 2 Shorts 360s.
Wow.
So we had 2 Short 360s and several Bandits. Phil was the GM, and we had a hell of a time with that.
I got to ask you, Steve, just as you said, you're going to set, he said, just casually, I'll set the airline up. That's no small undertaking in any point in time, but I'm curious as to how you found the setting that up and dealing with the regulator, which I guess that would have been the Civil Aviation Authority back at that time. That must have been an interesting process. It was,
but I've got to say it was a lot easier in those days. There wasn't the red tape and bureaucracy that goes on today. It wasn't easy, but it wasn't, as long as you did the right thing. A lot of stuff was done by reputation and by experience. In other words, they've dealt with you for 20 years. They know that you're going to do things properly because they did all the proper checks and paperwork had to be right. But we ended up starting in a fairly short period of time. And it went very well. We ended up running around southeast Queensland very successfully. But of course, guess what happened? Ansett went broke.
Yes. Right.
So we're sitting here. I got a call one morning to say we're terribly sorry, but Ansett went into liquidation today. And I rang my accountant and I said, "How much do Ansett owe us?" And they owed us $700,000, which was a lot of money to me and a lot of money to us and all of us. And of course, a business that we put a lot into was suddenly zero, and everything just got shut down. And we did manage to get some money out of that $700,000 through the liquidator, but wasn't all, and it really set us back quite a bit.
Yeah,
but interesting enough, the same day I got a call from Qantas. Qantas said, "You've got a good little operation there. We'd like to take it over. We'd like you to work for us, doing this what you've been doing for Ansett." And I said, "That's great. I'm so excited." And I said, "Good, under the same terms?" They said, "No." They said, "That's what sent Ansett broke," which it didn't. But they did a pretty good job of screwing us down to a very tight deal. But we continued on with that for some time. But in the end, unfortunately, we did too good a job, and they ended up taking it over themselves in a very, 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 very nice way. But in essence, they decided that now the traffic was good enough that they could justify their own aeroplanes on the routes.
It's often said that out of adversity comes opportunity, doesn't it? And that's certainly a story of that.
Exactly. But it did coincide with an interesting sideline. That is, we were operating metros in the end, along with the Bandits and Shorts on some of the longer routes. And we had one metro in Brisbane. We ended up getting our aeroplane serviced in Brisbane because that's where most of them are based. And unfortunately, an engineer decided to spray some PFC into the throttle quadrant and immediately pushed the throttles forward, which blew the cockpit to pieces. It blew the bulkhead to the rear of the aeroplane and left the poor engineer sitting in just a seat with first eardrum, uninjured otherwise. But we decided that was a message, and metros we found were getting old and maintenance intensive, and we said, look, this is with Qantas and all this. Let's just terminate the whole lot. It's been a great period and move on, which we did.
One of the questions is, so you got the Sunshine Express, you've done some amazing stuff there with Ansett and Qantas, but Sunshine Express, that wasn't the first airline you'd been involved in, was it?
No. Back in the Sydney days, when we were selling Banner Annies, we set up an airline called Great Lakes Airlines. It was Great Lakes Airlines, or Air Great Lakes, as it turned out to be, and operating a Bandit from Sydney to Foster. And we landed on the island. So that was done in conjunction with Davey Airlines, Bill Davey from Dubbo, which was owned by a grazier from Western New South Wales, who turned out to be a very good friend, or it resulted in being a very good friend of mine, and was a shareholder in Aeromore for a short period. But yeah, Air Great Lakes was a Bandit operation. It was a lot of fun again because it flew into the island, and we had a boat that ran from the airport to the mainland. And so it was a scenic trip for passengers as well as an airline service. But that actually was good because it did give us the chance to get a bit experienced about airline operations before we ended up eventually, of course, going into Sunshine Express.
Now, I understand you've also had some experience helping out with establishing airlines in Asia Pacific area and doing some work with charter and so on in the US.
Yeah, well, there's two stories there. I'll go. Probably the interesting story in Asia was because I was the Embraer dealer up there. I got to know quite a few people, and there's a company that was owned by a doctor in Bangkok, and they had a Piper Navajo. They used to fly for the CIA, believe it or not. And but they wanted to start an airline. And so I got talking to them. They said, look, this Banner Annie would be a good airline, a good replacement for the Navajo. And I said, yeah, but it's not ideal for Asia because, you've got, it's hot and humid and all that sort of stuff. They said, no, we want to give it a try. And it's not pressurised, that was the main reason. But I said, they want to try it. And they said, can you lease us an aeroplane? So again, cut a long story short, I painted one of my aeroplanes and in their colours, we trained their flight attendants, we trained their pilots. I flew it with all my family and friends, all 15 of us, I think, from here to Bangkok as a sort of a trip, which turned out to be a nightmare because we've got some very, very bad winds on the way to Western Australia, and then they have to fly at 15,000 feet, which of course wasn't very comfortable for the passengers. And the pilots had loads of fresh meat on board. Anyway, it was a long story. We eventually, of course, did get there safely. It was a ferry flight; it wasn't a commercial flight. And anyway, that airline turned out to be Bangkok Airways.
Oh wow!
Which is now one of the largest airlines in Southeast Asia. And it wasn't for that single Banner Annie that they operated on its own for 1 year with our help. That's what actually kick-started them into bigger and brighter airlines. And I've still got a welcome mat out from the fellow called Dr. Brevert, who is the owner and chairman of the airline, because of the beginnings that we helped them establish.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, the other story is, which is an interesting story, is Austin Aero. When I started buying aeroplanes and selling aeroplanes, I established a great friendship with a Texan fellow in Austin, Texas. I met him when I was buying a second-hand Banner Anti from over there at one point. We became firm friends, and he worked out of, interesting enough, Robert Mueller Airport has become famous recently. Robert Mueller was the airport for Austin in those days, and there was a FBO there that he had his base in that was like 5 big hangars. It was over 25 acres. It had a huge fuel farm that fueled Continental, Southwest Airlines, American. It was a big fuel, but there was a huge risk that the government were going to move the airport within 5 years to another site, but they may not either. So Austin Aero came up for sale by tender, and the reason it was up for sale by tender was the fellow who owned it was Governor Connolly, who of course was with President Kennedy when he was shot, and so he owned it, and then he went broke, and it was bought by somebody else, a bank, in fact. He went broke, and then they ended up being owned by the US government. So to cut a long story short again, we put a joke tender in, which we put together in one afternoon, and won it. Now, I won't tell you how much we put the tender in for, but it wasn't a lot of money, and we didn't think we had a hope in Hades to run it, because the result could have been worse than spending the initial money, because this business employed 25 Americans, all wanting to keep their jobs, and we had no idea how to run a FBO with a fuel farm and contracts with 8 major American airlines. Anyway, we did. We bought it. We said, "Here we go. This will be a challenge. It'll be a lot of fun." I was president of the company. Brad was my associate and partner, and Brad Lee, his name is, just a wonderful guy, and still is my very best friend. And he, so we got in there. I went over there quite a bit to help run it, but unfortunately, on the first day after we bought it and paid the US government for it, it had been raining for a week in Austin. And Austin is actually based on an aquifer, which means the water table is only 10 feet below the surface. So it rained and rained and rained and rained and rained. And we're having a get start party in the terminal. And it was a beautiful terminal. It was, it's typical of American terminals you see today. The gentleman who ran it was a very tall fellow and lovely bloke, and he ran the whole fuel activity. Came running in with very bright eyes, saying, "The fuel farm, the fuel farm." We raced out and had a look, and it was having had remedial work done by the US government as part of our deal. And unfortunately, the fuel tanks were coming up out of the ground like submarines.
Oh, no.
So they were turning vertically and coming up vertically out of the ground with thousands of gallons of jet fuel flowing out of them, unfortunately, towards a little creek, which ran down from the property. So the day we bought that thing was the day we almost lost it, in that we didn't have any fuel. So we couldn't. Yeah. Next day, we had to fuel all these airline airplanes with no fuel. So our biggest contract was with Southwest Airlines, who, as you know, has got over 900 737s, and it didn't in those days, of course. And the president was a fellow called Herb Kelleher, who became very famous and wrote a number of books. Yep. And I had to ring him, explain to him that we're going to be out of business. And he said, "Well, why can't you use a fuel from your competitor across the runway?" I said, "He won't sell it to us." We'd already tried that. He said, "He won't sell it to us because, of course, he thinks he'll get your contract and everyone else's contract because we'll be out of business. And Herb said, no, that's not the way we work. Within 2 days, he had tanks in there, no cost to us, full of fuel to keep us going. From then on, we built a brand new fuel farm.
That's an interesting contrast, isn't it, Steve? In my history, as I did the bulk of my flying training in the United States, and I find the attitude there to be quite different. And that story of Herb Kelleher there really says a lot about not just that man personally, but I find that attitude over there in the US. How did you find that experience over there compared to here in Australia?
Oh, wonderful. I mean, the best part about it, I mean, they do things there we can't do. Firstly, as you know and you've experienced, it's a whole friendly environment. Aviation is just a day-to-day business. You can drive onto an airport, you can drive up to an airplane, you can unload your stuff. There's hangars everywhere, there's airports everywhere. It's a day-to-day operation, nothing spectacular. Here it's treated as something that nobody really wants, especially the government and so on, and we're annoyance other than the airlines. And hopefully one day that'll change, and we've been trying to do that. But it's a hard, long road to run. But you're exactly right. We found it fantastic dealing with people. We loved people would pull up in their jets and they'd get out, and everyone was polite. And we had 3 presidents come through because the Bushes, of course, lived in Texas. They came through our operation. Where Clint Eastwood used to make films there and came in his helicopter. So, yeah, look, it was one of the most enjoyable times of my career because of what you just said. It's just wonderful to be involved in aviation at its best.
Yeah, it's funny. I've just come back from a trip over there and done some flying again, and it brings it back to me every time. Steve. Just sidetracking here, I guess, a little bit, but it's a pet topic of mine. Is I really wish we could bring some of that positivity about aviation from there over here. I don't know how we do it.
Yeah, the biggest problem we've got, of course, is that we just haven't got the population nor airports, within remote populations. If we had an equivalent of Austin, Texas, in the middle of Australia, and a lot of all these smaller towns, we'd have airports at every one of them, and it would grow itself. But unfortunately, if you go out to a remote airport, when I say a remote airport, an airport that's even got a seal runway, you've got to climb over the fence to get to your transport. I mean, there is just no facilities. Getting fuel's improbable. We've got the best airline services in the world operating on the East Coast. So it's very difficult to sell corporate airplanes these days when it's such a wonderful service in great new airplanes at a reasonable cost. Why would people buy corporate airplanes? So it's really just the base we've got is not big enough to create that sort of thing. If it was big enough, I'm sure the very enthusiastic, passionate people in aviation would make that happen.
And there we go, Grant. I'll tell you what, I'm still on that hobby horse about making GA a bit more fun over here in this part of the world. I am a bit biased, and people who are new to the show might not realise, but I actually did the bulk of my training in the United States, and anyone who's flown over there knows that the culture there in GA is quite often a lot different to here, and oftentimes, and I'm sad to say it, but it's a bit more positive and a bit more can-do over there at times. But hearing Steve Paget there talk about great airline service, Grant, of course, that was recorded just before the pandemic years, and I wonder what he'd say these days. They've been struggling a little bit, the airlines, I must say.
Well, they're a bit behind the 8 ball because the demand has come back way faster than any of their staff, many of whom have said not working for you lot anymore, and they've left the airline industry entirely.
Yeah, it's been good for us in railways. We've actually picked up a lot of ex-airline staff, and so far we've kept most of them, so that's a good thing for us. But maybe we're going back to the halcyon era of interstate rail travel. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing?
How does that jingle go? Trains good, planes bad?
Something like that, mate. Something like that. Yeah. Anyhow, so that's a really great series. We've got one more installment of that to go with Steve Paget, which we might hold off for a couple of episodes. But, that was just a really, great story to tell. And, something that might be interesting to pick up on now all these years later is what's happened with Alliance and where that's all going. Because, there's been a lot of news around that and their proposed acquisition by Qantas, and was it going to happen? Wasn't it going to happen? All that sort of stuff. So, but again, of course, that interview was recorded long before any of those shenanigans happened. So, You know, a lot of water under the bridge since then, but still one of those evergreen interviews that I really enjoyed producing.
It was great. Really good to chat with Steve. And hoping to have a chat with him again in the not too distant future. But, well, we'll believe that when it happens and we'll play it for you as soon as we've got it.
Well, that's everything we have for you on this episode of Playing Crazy Down Under. Thanks very much for joining us. Grant, of course, the email address, if anybody wants to get in touch with us, which we always encourage,
is contact@playingcrazydownunder.com.
Contact, Grant, we could have called it Clear Prop at Playing Crazy Down Under.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I like that. But please do reach out, folks. We love receiving the emails. Haven't received too many at the moment, but always up for an email. And if we start getting more emails and engagement, we might actually go back to what we used to do in the old days and maybe organise some comps or some meetups or things like that. Who knows?
Yeah, it'd be great fun. It's getting the show back into the ether and into the podcast world was a big decision for us last year. We're pretty happy with the way the show went last year, and we really would like to continue to regrow it in 2024. So let's make that all happen. This is a community. It's not just about me and Grant. It's a community, and we'd really like to re-establish that again because we had a great lot of fun doing that back in the day, and I'm always up for some more fun.
Oh, definitely. I'm definitely up for fun.
Anyhow, we're going to sign it off here. Steve Visscher and Grant McHerron wishing you very safe flying, folks. And until we talk to you again, have fun.
Find show notes for this episode, along with our contact details and a full back catalogue of shows at playingcrazydownunder.com. Drop us a line anytime with feedback, story suggestions or advertising inquiries. We'd love to hear from you. Title music is You Name It by Brian Simpson. Playing Crazy Down Under is a Southern Skies media production.
Southern Skies Media.